Thank you for coming this morning. I'm coming through okay on the audio? Wonderful. It's only for the recording. I can shush a lecture hall full of late teens at will with what my wife calls my teaching voice. Drew mentioned martyrdom and persecution, and we can't have one without the other. And part of what makes early modern England, early modern Europe so poignant is that many people were both. You could be a persecutor in the 1520s and a martyr in the 1530s, as we'll see. Before I launch into the 16th century, however, in January of this very year, the Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire, Rob Hirschfeld, I don't know how many of you saw this, attended a vigil for Renee Macklin Good, and according to NPR, he called out the, quote, cruelty, the injustice, and the horror unleashed in Minneapolis. And he warned his clergy, and this is what really caught my attention, he warned his clergy to prepare for, quote, a new era of martyrdom. I've asked them to get their affairs in order and make sure they have their wills written, he said, because it may be that now is no longer the time for statements, but for us with our bodies to stand between the powers of this world and the most vulnerable, end quote. That's January 2026, the Bishop of New Hampshire, again, Rob Hirschfeld. We don't hear that kind of language a lot in the Christian community in the 21st century. We don't think of Episcopalian bishops as offering us that kind of language. It really caught my attention, and it made me think about martyrdom in a new context. I talk about martyrdom all the time. I teach 16th and 17th century British and European history, and this was a fact of life. So taking what I teach on a regular basis and thinking about a 21st century American Episcopalian bishop telling his clergy to have their wills written because the day may come when they were called upon to die for their faith. But that caught my attention, as I said. Martyrdom in the 16th century was not a daily occurrence. It's not like you walked down the street and saw someone being burned. But it was also not an uncommon spectacle. And it was a spectacle. Martyrdom executions were public. They were very intentionally public. Almost all executions were public. The only people executed in private were the very, very high-born, so they could avoid the shame of it. And that was mercy shown to their rank in society. Most people executed for whatever crime were executed publicly. People attended because it was a spectacle. The way you can't take your eyes off a car wreck, people would attend the execution, and they would have opinions about how the condemned had conducted themselves during the execution. But it was a spectacle, and it was meant to convey a very clear message to the people who were watching about the importance of political loyalty on the one hand and unity of faith on the other. And the thing that makes early modern history so fascinating to me, part of it anyway, is the way in which all of these things are linked together. The politics, the religion, and the violence are so deeply intertwined, they simply cannot be disentwined. To understand religion, you must understand the politics, and very much as a political historian, to understand the politics, you've got to understand the faith, theology, and the violence with which all of this is enforced. Every country in Europe had its own experience with martyrdom during the wars of religion, the age of religious Reformation. Catholics and Protestants viewed one another as wrong, certainly, but also as evil. And that the stakes could not be higher because if this virus of the wrong faith gets loose among us, it will corrupt those who are less educated, those who are less knowledgeable about how things, the right way of doing things, and that imperils their immortal souls. So the stakes are incredibly high that the right answers are reached, and the right answers must be enforced at times with violence. So in England, this is particularly fraught because times were especially unstable and unpredictable. So here are the Tudor dynasty over most of the 16th century and spilling just into the 17th century. In 1521, you don't need to remember the years for the exam, but in 1521, King Henry VIII was awarded the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X. The faith in question was Roman Catholicism. The Pope bestowed that title upon Henry VIII and his heirs ever after. That's 1521. In 1534, Henry had fully completed a break with the Roman Catholic Church that named him Defender of the Faith, still seeing himself as the defender of the faith, which the Catholic Church had corrupted in his mind. By 1534, he's broken with the Catholic Church and established the Protestant Lutheran faith in England. By 1550, England is arguably the most radically reformed nation in Europe. Calvin in Geneva would have something to say about that, perhaps, although they're learning closely from Calvin in Geneva. England is becoming a haven for Protestant refugees from the rest of Europe. By 1553, when Edward died young, age 16, probably of tuberculosis, his eldest sister Mary succeeded him, and Mary was a Roman Catholic and reestablished the Roman Catholic Church in England. And when Mary died in 1558, in her late 40s, her sister, Queen Elizabeth, succeeded to the throne. Elizabeth was another Protestant, and rebuilt a Protestant faith in England, once again breaking from the Roman Catholic Church. And so in the span of one human generation, about 30 years, England experienced the entire spectrum of Christian religious faith that was available in mid-16th century Europe. The church that Elizabeth builds is even further reformed than the one that her father Henry had created. It's a Calvinist church. Again, the Calvinist experience and input from Geneva is flooding into England as well. In this tumultuous environment, it's easy for an orthodox and unremarkable Christian at one point in time to find themselves persecuted and ultimately executed by the state and the church for heresy a few months, at most a few years later. And since the church in England was and is an established church, that is to say, a church established in law as the right church, it is inextricable that you take the faith and the politics together. To be guilty of religious heterodoxy, heresy, is also part and parcel of being guilty of political crimes, such as sedition or treason, because the church is an arm of the state and vice versa. Given all of that, common everyday people of faith, trying to make a way in this tumultuous world, have choices to make. And those choices for them may literally be a matter of life and death. Again, it's not as if there were martyrs being executed every day, but it was omnipresent as a threat, and it certainly happened on a regular enough basis that most people, especially living in cities like London, would have been able to see martyrs dying for their faith. The easiest way to survive in this world is to be uncommitted, to be flexible in one's understanding of one's religious faith. You go to church on Sunday, as you always have. There'll be a worship service. Maybe it's Catholic, maybe it's Protestant. It might be in English. It might be in Latin. It's not like it's changing weekly, but all of that would have been experienced in one human lifetime, really in one decade, depending on the decade you're talking about. There may or may not be a sacrament of confession. If there is, you'd better go. If there's not, you'd better not ask about it. Being flexible in your faith, having a rather uncommitted, broad understanding of what faith could mean was your best way to survive, and this seems to have been what most people did. Most people did not experience martyrdom personally. This includes members of the clergy. There are plenty of priests, Christian priests, who practiced their faith and administered their parishes all the way through this tumultuous period by being flexible and obedient to what the laws of the time demanded. Especially in an era of rapid population growth, which means lots of new people being brought into the world all the time. 16th century was such an era. Over time, the old generations die out, the new generations rise up, and England was able to create and to forge and to cement a recognizable, distinct Protestant English faith and church, the Church of England, as it came to be known. And that term, by the way, was meant to distinguish the English church, for which the monarch was now personally responsible, from the rest of the Christian community. The Church of England is what Henry VIII asserted control over, not Christendom in general. However, some people were not so flexible. For those who are perhaps most deeply engaged with their faith, for those perhaps who have a more stubborn streak than others, being flexible, being uncommitted was not what the Christian message was calling them to do, and it was not an acceptable answer. It was, in fact, a sin. To compromise for some Christians was a sin. Thomas More actually speaks to this eloquently. If you don't see a problem with taking such and such an oath, then you have not sinned. You've merely stated what you believe. But if I take that oath with what I believe, I have imperiled my soul, and I can't do that. You may be able to do that and do it without sinning, but I can't. So for some people, this is the crux of it. They cannot find it in them to compromise, to risk losing their soul by professing to believe before God, with their hand on a Bible, something they do not, in fact, believe. That is to imperil your soul. And some chose instead to stand on their faith in that circumstance, even when the consequences for doing that were vital. And here's a few of those individuals. I've mentioned Sir Thomas More already. More is a great example of all of this, a man who could not compromise in his faith, but also a man who was persecutor and persecuted. More was a personal friend of King Henry VIII. He had served the king for a time as Lord Chancellor during the early era of the Reformation, but More was not willing to follow Henry in breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. He saw plenty of problems, spilled a lot of ink writing about all the problems in the Roman Catholic Church. It needed a lot of help, but for More, it needed help from within. It needed reform. It did not need splitting with, and he could not follow Henry in this path. More once wrote, "I do none harm. I say none harm. I think none harm, but wish everybody good." Unquestionably, More sees himself as a faithful Christian. But More also wrote that it was no sin to lie and to break faith with heretics because they were already outlaw. They were already beyond the law and the protection of God. And therefore, it was no sin to lie to them, to offer them mercy and then deny that mercy, to swear that you would spare them and then to execute them anyway. This was no sin for Thomas More. And while he was Lord Chancellor, we know he executed or oversaw the execution, the burning at the stake, of at least 3 Protestants as heretics in England. I think none harm. And he meant that. Nevertheless, he burned heretics to death. And then, when the king broke away from the Church of Rome, More suddenly found himself on the wrong side of the same line. And he was executed himself. And the crime he had committed was being unwilling to swear that the King of England was the supreme head of the Church of England. An office he recognized only the Pope could hold. He would not swear the oath, and for not swearing the oath, for denying the king's supremacy of the Church of England, More was executed for treason in that case. The crime he had committed was treason by denying the king's supremacy. More was a particularly famous martyr, and A Man for All Seasons and Wolf Hall and many other tellings of the story all deal with us. There were lots of other martyrs. More is only the top sort of famous member of this chain. Among them are Bishop John Fisher, Cardinal John Fisher. While he's the one who defended Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, from the charges that their marriage were invalid. For this crime, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Catholic Church chose to escalate this controversy by promoting Bishop Fisher to Cardinal Fisher. Henry famously said that if the Pope wanted to send a red hat north to England for Fisher to wear, Henry would send his head south to meet it, and had Fisher beheaded for the crime of treason, for also not swearing the king's supremacy over the church. And again, beyond them, there's the Charterhouse monks. The Charterhouse monks they're also known as the Grey Friars, were known throughout London for their piety, for their devotion to Christ. They too would not swear the king's supremacy, and over the next several months, 18 of them were hanged, drawn, and quartered. For those who don't know their English execution methods, this was the worst that you could have happen to you in England. They would hang you by the neck until you had passed out, not died, passed out. Then they would cut you down. They would split you from nape to groin. They would tear out your innards and throw them in the fire. Then they would tie each of your limbs to a different horse, and they would slap the horses to tear you into 4 pieces, hung, drawn, quartered. They would throw the carrion out for the birds and stick your head on a pike over the gates of London Bridge. That was the penalty for treason. It didn't happen to all criminals. Most people who were just guilty of theft or assault or something were simply hanged. This was a special treat, a special spectacle that was reserved for those who had committed treason. That's what happened to the Charterhouse monks. A monastery full of men known for their piety. This was what they were rewarded with for their piety. Henry would say their stubbornness. Henry would say their treason. And this was what the faith of the Charterhouse monks faced. There was also the rebels in the Pilgrimage of Grace, an anti-Reformation rebellion that took place in 1536, mostly in the north of England. Hundreds of people rising up because they objected, among other things, to the dissolution of the monasteries. What they saw is the robbing and pillaging and rapine of the church by the king and his sinful advisors. Henry crushed the rebellion and executed hundreds of the rebels by the time he was done, for in their minds, defending the monasteries. In Henry's mind, committing rebellion and treason. Excuse me just a moment. I'm going to have to wander over there my water a few times. So that's the Henrician Reformation. We're only just getting started. The rise of Queen Mary and the restoration of Roman Catholicism in England leads to a new wave of martyrdom. This time, Protestants, once again, the target of it. Mary has a very sad life. She was inconvenient in every imaginable way. She's the only surviving child of the union of Catherine of Aragon and Henry. She's the wrong gender and has been an embarrassment in that regard literally since the minute she entered the world. She's been an embarrassment and an inconvenience to Henry. They've dangled her as marriage bait before half the nobility of Europe, but she's never been allowed to marry. The Reformation happened, and Princess Mary was unwilling to renounce her Catholic faith, which made her not only inconvenient, but deeply, deeply problematic. She was essentially held in house arrest and internal exile. She was denied any access to her mother, to whom she was very close. She's been badly neglected by both Henry, her father, and her brother Edward while he was king, not least because of her refusal to renounce her Roman Catholic faith. Mary has suffered for her Roman Catholic faith. Her refusing to give it up has mattered to her, mostly in negative ways. She sees herself rightly as a victim. She probably equated Protestantism not just with heresy, but with cruelty and with pain and with destruction. From Mary's point of view, these evil heretics have destroyed the Church of England, and her divine mission is to restore it. She does not seem to have initially intended a reign of terror in order to achieve that. Mary seems to have thought that most people in England, most right-thinking English Christians, would actually welcome a return to the Roman Catholic Church. Some of them unquestionably did. Many of them unquestionably just decided that they were as happy to go to church in Latin as they were in English, and it didn't really make much difference. They weren't that committed in the first place. We're not talking about an era of deep theological learning among most of the Christian community. It didn't probably matter to most folks one way or the other, but it did matter to some. There were some Protestants, even by 1553, who were willing to put up a fight rather than compromise about their Protestant faith. Enough people did stand their ground that Mary and her Catholic advisors and bishops decided they had to take action. They were going to have to make some examples. They were going to have to take all of those who were shaky in the Roman Catholic faith and bring them back into the proper Catholic fold. As I say, that was going to be done through making examples, taking the heretics and punishing them for their heresy, the proper punishment for which was being burned at the stake. As under Henry, Mary's reign produced some famous martyrs. You're looking at probably the three most famous: Bishop Hugh Latimer, Bishop Nicholas Ridley, and on the far right here, Bishop Thomas Cranmer, the author of the Book of Common Prayer, the creator, in any theological and doctrinal sense, of a Protestant Church of England. All three were burned at the stake by Mary for their heresy. The fascinating one, though, is Cranmer. Cranmer struggled with his martyrdom. Cranmer didn't want to die for the faith. He actually, through a series of confessions that got progressively more advanced, ultimately Cranmer renounced the Protestant faith and the Protestant church he had built. He signed his name to documents that declared that this was heresy. He should never have supported it. He was deeply contrite for ever having done so. But in the end, Cranmer accepted his fate. He recanted his recantation. In a sermon he was supposed to preach to demonstrate his obedience and his humility, he instead in that moment chose to stand his ground, and they took him straight out to the public square in Oxford, where they burned him at the stake. And here you can see what that looked like. There's Latimer and Ridley on the left here. Cranmer famously pronounced that when he was being burned, he would shove his right hand into the flame, because that was the hand that had sinned. That was the hand that had signed the confession, recanting his Protestant faith. This unworthy right hand were supposedly his last words, burning the hand that had betrayed him rather than allowing him to courageously accept his fate and his martyrdom and die a horrible death. There's a commemoration plaque in Oxford, the public square in Oxford where this took place, and you can see there in the middle of the street there's a cross to this day made of stone where the exact spot on which these burnings took place. It was in Oxford, England. Those are the famous ones. The vast majority of the Protestant martyrs under Mary's reign, however, were not bishops. In fact, quite a few of the bishops fled England. Where did they go? They went to Geneva, where they hung out with Calvin for a few years, and this is how Calvinism really gets introduced in England when those guys come home. They are the bleeding edge of Protestantism by the time they get home, and that's what becomes the Elizabethan Church. The ones who didn't get away were burned, but the vast majority of those who were burned in Mary's reign were not famous. They were common men and women. Most were from the southeast of England. This has to do with literacy. The Protestant church is a literate church. Literacy rates were highest in and around London, where there were schools and some money to pay to people to go to them. And so the highest rates of literacy are where we see the highest rates of Protestant faith. And so most of the martyrs under Mary were from the southeast of England. About 80% were Londoners. They were both men and women. They were generally poor and what we call the middling sort, those who were not poor peasants or beggars, but were urban laborers, tradesmen, craftsmen, artisans, and their families. That's where Protestantism was really strongest, and those are the people who were disproportionately martyred as a result. We're talking also about people who are quite young, people who are in their teens and 20s mostly. This stands to reason because they are the people who would never have remembered being raised in a Roman Catholic Church of England. They were born into, or at least all they can remember, is a Protestant Church of England. So it tends to be the youngest who take this faith seriously, most seriously. And as a result, the majority of the martyrs under Mary were younger folks, people, as I say, in their teens and 20s. Also, most lay people. There were clergy martyred, obviously a few bishops. But the majority of the martyrs under Mary were lay people. They were not priests. They were not famous. They were just people, artisans and tradesmen from London mostly, who were unwilling to compromise about, for them, this most important aspect of their selves, of their souls. Under Mary, there were about 300 Protestant martyrs burned at the stake. There's a lot of pictures of that, by the way, and I'll get to that in a minute. About 300 martyrs burned at the stake. About as many, again, probably died in prison of one of the many diseases you could catch in prison, awaiting their execution. So the true number is probably closer to 500 to 600 martyrs all told. There are a lot of pictures because of John Foxe, his book Acts and Monuments, generally known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. It is a lavishly illustrated book throughout the 16th century. The law stipulated under Queen Elizabeth that every parish church in England had to have 3 books in it. It had to have the Holy Bible in English, it had to have the Book of Common Prayer, and it had to have Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And of those, only Foxe's Book of Martyrs contained illustrations. In a world without literacy, that's the only book most people are going to be interested in. Those are some of the illustrations from Foxe's Book of Martyrs. They wanted people to know these stories as much as they wanted them to know the conversation with the lady at the well and the Sermon on the Mount and the giving the blind man his sight. They wanted people to know these stories too. And that's why there were pictures to tell them these stories. The Catholics, by the way, were not as good at this on the whole. They don't seem to have... lots of pictures of the martyrs, but not being martyred. They were not thinking of that aspect of the propaganda capacity of this. Mary meant to make examples of these people, scaring people back to the Roman faith who were a little unsure about it. She did succeed in making them examples, but she completely failed in the way she went about doing it. Protestants are known to have attended these executions to gather their strength, to gather their courage, to gather inspiration. They were waiting for the scaffold speech. It's not a scaffold because it's a stake. The condemned were allowed to speak, to make a last statement. They wanted to hear that statement. They wanted to hear a last statement of defiance, of faith, of commitment, commending my soul to the Lord, so that I too could take some courage from that, so that if necessary, I would have the courage to face the same fate the same way. Much like Cranmer, he recanted his recantation after Ridley and Latimer had been burned. How can I allow them to be burned while I sit here cowardly signing these confessions? It was their execution which gave him the strength. So Mary did make examples of these people, but not in the way that she'd intended. They become examples of defiance, of commitment, of fidelity. And that is partly why there were so many. Mary, again, did not anticipate there would be that much resistance. There was, and it surprised her. Once you started down that road, it's really the only tool you have. So again, there's a woman being burned in the upper right. You get a sense of what these might have looked like through woodcuts of the era. It continues during Elizabeth's reign. Mary dies in 1558, as I said. Like her sister, Elizabeth did not initially intend a campaign of terror and martyrdom for her Roman Catholic subjects. The initial church settlement, the Elizabethan settlement in 1559, actually took a remarkably lenient line toward England's still significant Catholic community. They're somewhere between a very large minority and a small majority at that point, and Elizabeth knows it. In order to knit the realm back together, Elizabeth's settlement envisioned a sort of big tent approach to the church with a lot of latitude about what you could believe and still be on the right side of the line. In a nutshell, it was possible in the early years of Elizabeth's reign to remain an English Catholic. You had enough spiritual latitude to do that as long as you didn't create political trouble. In other words, you had spiritual latitude if you didn't create political problems. It was the politics, the declaring, death to the queen and that sort of thing that was going to get you in trouble. Short of that, Elizabeth preferred, and her advisors preferred, to leave people alone. Unfortunately, trouble found English Catholics. They didn't have to make it, it found them. In 1569, about 10 years into Elizabeth's reign, there was a rebellion in the north of England led by Catholic nobility. Part of their intended goal was to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with the Roman Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and put her on the throne. So in 1569, there's an avowedly Catholic rebellion against Queen Elizabeth. In 1570, in one of the great public relations blunders of the 16th century, Pope Pius V excommunicated Queen Elizabeth. And in that excommunication, he told all English Catholics that they were no longer bound by ties of obedience to their monarch, for she was a heretic, and indeed declared it was the sacred duty of all English Catholics to try to overthrow their sovereign queen, who was a heretic. So now if you're an English Catholic, trouble has found you. You aren't responsible for these idiot noblemen launching their stupid rebellion in the north, which never had a ghost of a chance of succeeding. It was small, it was pitiful, it was easily crushed. By the time the excommunication announcement had gotten to England, intended to help the rebellion succeed, the rebellion was long over. So now if you're an English Catholic, maybe you participated in the rebellion, much more likely you did not even know about it. And now the Pope has told you it's your sacred duty not to obey your queen, but in fact to try to overthrow her. You're not interested in overthrowing the queen. That was never what you signed on for. That is not what you see your church to mean, your faith to be about. And yet, now you don't really have a choice. You're in the middle of it. The queen and the Pope have put you in a position where you can either be loyal to the queen or you can be a faithful Catholic, and you cannot be both. At this point, Elizabeth has little choice. Her advisors have little choice. These people are an obvious fifth column. The Catholic community in England, which had been relatively quiet for a few years, has launched a rebellion. They've now declared the queen as a heretic and needs to be killed and overthrown. There are further assassination plots that arise in 1571, 1572, and as a result, they have little choice but to go after the English Catholic community. This is when anti-Catholic persecution begins, 1570 or so. Parliament passes a series of increasingly harsh laws. Anyone who refuses to acknowledge the Queen as the head of the Church of England is charged and committed of treason. Crippling fines are levied on anyone who does not regularly attend Protestant worship. Catholic priests are strictly outlawed, and merely sheltering one becomes a capital offense that they can kill you for, because the priests themselves are seen as the fomenters of treason. The Catholic community, however, is utterly dependent upon consecrated priests. According to Catholic theology, you can't go to heaven unless you receive the sacraments. The sacraments cannot be performed by anyone but a consecrated Roman Catholic priest. No Catholic priests, no Catholic community, no Catholic faith. Those priests have to be there. And yet it's a capital crime to be one or to shelter one. And so young Englishmen, mostly from noble and upper class families, stole out of England into France, where they attended seminary. They were consecrated as Jesuit missionary priests. We think of the Jesuits traveling to China and Japan and Quebec and trying to minister to the non-Christian peoples all over the world. Many of them did. Many of them traveled back to England. They were English, the younger sons of noble and gentry family, became Jesuit missionary priests, smuggled back into England to serve now largely in hiding Catholic community. These priests were a precious and vital commodity, and they had to be sheltered and hidden so far as possible. This is why so many northern mansions in England have priest holes, and they're still called priest holes. Space behind the chimney maybe, just about large enough to shelter a full-grown man without being detected in any other way. They often posed as gardeners and footmen of the Catholic nobility in whose houses they were placed. And on Sunday, quietly, they would minister to the noble family and all the tenants and servants in the estate and the household until they were caught. The average life expectancy of a Jesuit Catholic missionary in England was about 6 months. The state wanted to find these people. And they hunted them awfully hard. They had spies, they had informers. Think of a noble household with all the tenants and all the dozens of servants, and there's a Catholic priest hiding there, and one of them is angry about a cross word. One of them feels they're not well remunerated enough for their long and hard labor. One of them is actually a believing Protestant and is appalled at what's going on here. It only takes one. And they tell the authorities, and the priest, if they find the hole he's hiding in, is rooted out, interrogated under torture to give up all the names that we can squeeze out of him. And when we're done with that, he's going to be executed as a traitor, hung, drawn, and quartered for the crime of treason. There are probably about as many Catholic martyrs under Elizabeth as there were Protestant martyrs under Mary. That is to say, all told, probably around 500, including those who died in prison. There was no shortage of younger sons of gentry and noble families taking this path toward ordination so they could come back, live 6 months, serve their community, and die that death. They were the boogeyman as far as the Elizabethan regime were considered, but they were the lifeblood of the English Catholic community, and they understood both of those things and were unwilling to compromise about it. So, interestingly, and one thing to note, we've got burnings, we got beheading, hung, drawn, and quartered here. Those are appropriate punishments for different crimes. Religious crimes, the appropriate punishment, witchcraft being another example, is being burned at the stake. Under Mary, Protestants were accused and convicted of heresy, of not accepting the true church, and that's why they were burned. Under Elizabeth, Catholics, according to the Catholic regime, they never saw themselves as persecuting people for their faith. The crime these people had committed was refusing to acknowledge the supreme head, supreme governor by that point, of the Church of England being the monarch rather than the Pope. That's a political crime. That's a crime of treason. The appropriate punishment for treason is being hung, drawn, and quartered. So both we recognize today as martyrs, but again, William Cecil Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's chief advisor, insisted to his dying day they had never persecuted anyone for their faith in England. They were persecuting them because they were traitors who refused to acknowledge the Queen's being the supreme head of the Church of England. That was their crime. Well, that's obviously a religiously inflected crime, but it's treason. It's not heresy. And that's why the punishment is different under each monarch. The main point I want to stress here is that the vast majority of all of these people, Protestant and Catholic, martyrs in the 16th century, were neither famous nor important. They were neither heroes nor rebels, and they were not trying to be. This wasn't something they sought. Very few, if any, of these people sought their martyrdom. That wasn't how you were supposed to approach martyrdom. If it found you, you were supposed to stand courageous in it. But you weren't supposed to go looking for it, and these people generally didn't. They were everyday people, many of them quite young. most of them not clergy, particularly among the Protestants, who found themselves stuck, forced to choose at some point between what they believe in their souls and what the authorities tell them it is licit for them to believe, between obedience to the crown and obedience to God as they understood it. The best encapsulation of this, once again, is Thomas More. Famously, his last words on the scaffold, "I die the king's good servant, God's first." I die the king's good servant, but God's first. That's the crux of it right there, the inability to serve both of those at the same time and having to choose, choosing to be God's servant first rather than the king's servant. None of these people wanted to die any more than you want to be burned at the stake or hung, drawn, and quartered. I try to tell my students history isn't a box in your black and white attic. It would have to be a black and white attic, let's face it, labeled, martyrdom or the Holocaust or any of the darker chapters in our history. We like to put them in the box, the dusty box in the attic of time, like it doesn't have any connection to us now any more than our great-grandmother's clothing has a connection to us now. We may be aware that it's in the attic, but we would never take it out and put it on. And yet, as I say, the Bishop of New Hampshire saying, hey, we've been issuing statements. How's that working out for you? Statements may not be enough this time. It may become necessary for us to take further steps. We commemorate, and you can see these are just a few of the plaques in England that you can still see commemorating the martyrdoms. People have been to Westminster. I figured a lot of folks in this place have been to Westminster Abbey. Have you seen this frieze over the main door into the nave? It's the 10 modern martyrs. They're all 20th century martyrs. These were niches over the main door into the nave that had been empty for God knows how long, decades if not centuries. In the late 1990s, the church decided to put 10 martyrs in those niches, all from the 20th century, from all over the world. I don't know if I do have a laser pointer. That's Martin Luther King Jr. right there, the only American in the bunch. They were, again, from all over the world. But to walk into this building, this 1,000-year-old Christian building, and see 20th century martyrs looking down upon you as you walk in the door, again, this is not just the dusty old box of history in the black and white attic. This is living memory. Again, I don't have to tell you, he spoke right over there. He's pictured as a martyr on Westminster Abbey. And the Bishop of New Hampshire has called us once again to think about this. Not to do it. Don't go out and try to get yourself killed. But if the choice comes, what are you going to do? If you have to put your body between this and that, and the Lord your God is telling you to do it, what are you going to do? That's a hard choice. It was as hard a choice for them as it would be for you. So I thought, Maureen told me I could speak on whatever I wanted, and after I read that statement, I thought, I know what I want to talk about today. I talk about this all the time, but I rarely get to do it this timely. Ripped from the headline. Martyrdom and ripped from the headlines history don't usually go together, but in this case, they happen to a certain extent. Anyway, that's all I have. Yes.
Does that suggest theocracy? And is there any parallels to what was happening 400 years ago or 500 years ago and today?
That's a lot of questions. It doesn't imply a theocracy insofar as it's not a priestly class that's in charge. Priests are not governing England. The King of England is not a priest. In fact, you can't be a clergyman because you're supposed to be celibate and you got to produce an heir. It's a hereditary monarchy. That comes up from time to time, believe it or not. In any case, it is, however, a world that has no acknowledgement or understanding of the separation of church and state. Would in fact think that a terrible idea, because one of the king's most sacred and sovereign duties is to protect the church and the faith within his realm. The king is not a priest, but at the coronation ceremony, it is a bishop in a cathedral who in England's case, Westminster Abbey, who takes the crown and puts it on the king's head and anoints the king's head with holy oil and blesses the king. And the king swears a solemn, sacred oath, the coronation oath. So the king is not a priest, but but the king is consecrated by that bishop and therefore by God and rules with God's approbation. And one of the most important, if not the most important jobs he has is to protect the faith within his realm, the right faith. So it is not a theocracy, but it is a world in which the separation of church and state would have seemed to them like a terrible idea. That simply isn't what you should be doing. And hence we get the martyrdoms. And then in England, it's inflected when they break from the Roman Catholic Church, and the Church of England that names the monarch as the supreme head, later the supreme governor of that church. Now, as I say, it's an arm of the state insofar as to be guilty of heterodoxy is to be guilty of political crimes as well. You cannot separate the two. Yeah, Cheryl.
I was reading this week that the Trump administration is going to create National Guards in each state to put down civil unrest. So now we've got that to deal with too in the future, which made me think of your contemporary.
Just like my students, I have a lot of trouble. I just got done teaching the Luddites and the rise of industrialization. It's very hard for me to keep a historical discussion, depending on the subject matter, in the 16th, 18th, 19th centuries. They want to pull these things and take the lessons from them. Yes, in this case, I've been rather explicit about it. I kind of lean into this. There's always dangers in bringing the past into the present or the present into the past with you. They're different, and they need to be held distinct that way. But why do we care about any of this? Because we're still sitting around the campfire telling stories about our ancestors. That's what I do for a living. In my mind, that's what I'm doing every single time I walk into a class. And when I'm walking to a class, I try and think to myself every day, why am I going to waste the time and energy of 25 teenagers with this nonsense today? Why is this worth that? If I don't have an answer for that question, I can't do it. So there has to be a reason why this matters. And sometimes it's a little easier than others. Sometimes the question answers itself. This is one where we need to think very carefully. I also tell them constantly the separation of church and state is a very expensive idea, and we paid for it for 200 years, and the currency was blood. We bought that idea with 200 years of blood, and you lose that at your peril. Is it a perfect world? No, not really. It's by far better than all the alternatives, where the state can make you believe a thing you do not believe and punish you grievously if you don't. That's the other alternative, and we paid for that in blood. Mike?
Eric, it wasn't the end of it with Elizabeth either.
Oh, no.
It went on through Cromwell and that. Again, they actually taught the king. We used to sing a song in school when I was growing up called The Vicar of Bray. And the lyrics are the following. In good King Charles's golden time, when royalty no harm meant, a zealous high churchman was I, and so I gathered preferment. To teach my flock I never missed, kings are by God appointed. And damned are those who dare resist or touch the Lord's anointed. And this be law, and I'll maintain until my dying day, that whatsoever king may reign, still I'll be the vicar of Bray. When royal James possessed the crown and property came in fashion, the penal laws I hooted down and read the declaration. The Church of Rome, I found, did fit full well my constitution. And I had been a Jesuit but for the revolution. It goes on with several more verses.
The Army War College considers the beginning of the modern era the year 1648. That is the moment the modern world starts, and their reason for that is it's the end of the 30 Years' War, which was a Catholic-Protestant battle royale that lasted 30 years, the worst man-made disaster that ever befell Europe before the 20th century. It was absolutely ruinous. Genocide, ethnic cleansing. They figure maybe 1 harvest out of 5 was taken in during that period. At the end of it, we start to crawl ourselves toward the idea that maybe it would be okay not to kill people for worshiping differently than we do, though it takes another 100 years. I dispute 1648 because my response is always, tell that to a Catholic peasant in 1845, that we're not really bothering killing each other over Catholic-Protestant violence anymore. Tell that to a Catholic peasant in Ireland in 1845. I dare you. The wars, the huge grand wars may now be about territory and geopolitics, but there's a lot of religious hatred left, and not a little of it lives in these funny-looking islands off the northwest coast of Europe to this day. Tony Blair, as I tell my students, married a Catholic woman and converted to Roman Catholicism right after he retired. There was no way he was going to be a Roman Catholic prime minister in the United Kingdom. Simply couldn't happen. That's in 1997, so for what it's worth.
We've got, I mean, we've just the synagogue in Littlefield Hills. It's not Anglican versus Rome, but it's still there.
It's also not just Christians. The people who most get the Reformation when I'm trying to teach it, it's actually really hard to make an 18-year-old American understand young Englishmen going off to become Jesuit priests to come home and live a year and die. But my Muslim students get this innately. They're still living with Sunni Shia violence, and many of them very aware of that. Many of them have family implicated by that, caught up in it. So when I explain Catholic, Protestant, both Christian, but really don't like each other, they get that. And it's wonderful to have a couple of those students or more in my history classes, because they can explain it to Americans for whom, wait, they were killing each other because of what vestments the priest was wearing? Yeah, that's what that was what that riot was about. It's hard to believe now, but there it is.